Hey all, I hope you're all staying safe and well, whether you're catching this with us live or watching the recording. I really appreciate your attention and your time. My name is Michael Richardson. I am the chapter director here at Startup Grind. I'm also a startup mentor and a venture scout. So, that's kind of gives you more context around why this was one of the first events that I decided to put on. So my driving purpose is to help build bridges between purpose and resources for non-traditional founders. So it's to put it frankly, I'm trying to help y'all get the bag. This is the first official relaunch event for Startup Grind Birmingham. And if you're not familiar, Startup Grind was launched in 2010, and it's the largest global community of startups, founders, innovators, and creators. We bring like-minded yet diverse individuals together to connect, learn, teach, help, build, and belong. We stand on three core values: give first, make friends, not contacts, and help others before yourself. Membership, there's also startup membership, which is free for accepted startups and gives access to exposure and direct introduction opportunities to top investors and our partners. Free access to Startup Summit at the 2021 Global Conference that'll be happening virtually next year. Members only partner offers worth an upwards of $115,000 and a whole lot more. So as I mentioned, this is the first event in the official chapter relaunch for Birmingham. My goal with this relaunch is to help be a catalyst in accelerating the growth of an inclusive startup ecosystem through aligning local, regional, and national stakeholders and mobilizing them around one common objective: to empower entrepreneurs through education and capital. Tonight is the first of those efforts. Black founders get less than 3% of venture funding, yet there's data to support that diverse founding and executive teams generate better returns of over 30%. Rather than to get on my own soapbox about this, I wanted to bring in one of the OGs in the game to drop these gems. And with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Carmen Mays, founder and CEO of Elevators on 4th, and our featured guest, Rodney Sampson, founder and CEO of OHub.
Well, good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Carmen Mays. I am a Birmingham native, and I'm really excited about the relaunching of Startup Grind. And I'm joined here by the illustrious Rodney Sampson, as we say on the route to the good cues. Uh, and he is definitely an OG in the game. I have some questions for him that are going to touch on a few topics. But before we jump into it, I always like to start these types of sessions off with a few ground rules. I just want you to know that you may hear no, you may hear things that you do not like. You may hear things that contradict things that you already believe. But in order for there to be growth and understanding and improvement, I ask that you keep an open mind, open notebook, and in all things, an open heart. All right, so we'll jump right into it. Um, Rodney, the first question, will allow you to introduce yourself as well as talk about your background. So you started a tech company way back in the back then when we didn't even know for sure what tech companies were and how all this worked. So if you would please tell us, what was it like being a tech founder back then? And things have changed drastically. So, over the arc of your experience, what's become easier and what's become more difficult?
Well, first and foremost, Carmen, it's good to see you, and I'm excited to be here on such an auspicious, auspicious occasion, particularly the relaunch of Startup Grind Birmingham. I don't think there's a shortage of work anywhere in America as it relates to building equitable ecosystems. And so I applaud Macau, right? Did I get that right? I applaud him and his work, and I appreciate the introduction from our partners at Revolution and Rise of the Rest. And I also hope you all who are watching are doing well, considering just everything that's going on in the world right now. If you're live or watching this in the future, you might be watching this 20 years from now, but we are in the 10th month of the first year of a new decade that seems like it's already been a whole decade. So, and Carmen, thank you for your work and for your vision and also your resolve as well. So to jump right in, I started my first technology company, and I preface that because before I started my first tech company, I was an entrepreneur in medical school. I was an entrepreneur in undergraduate. And so I had been developing my skills as a business owner for a while. And in 2000, I co-founded one of the first internet streaming companies 20 years ago. And the first, obsessive problem that I wanted to solve was one that was near and dear to me because I grew up in Atlanta. We called it the SWATs affectionately. And I grew up in a family. I had 4 uncles who were pastors of churches. And so I grew up in the church. I grew up as a musician, as an organist and a keyboardist and a pianist. And so, I knew the business of church. And one of the things that I knew was that pastors, particularly Black pastors, were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to be seen weekly on national television networks. And so I'm like, there's something here. If we can help these pastors reach potentially billions of people at a fraction of the cost of what they're paying to reach millions, then I think we've got a, not only a total addressable market, but we've got product, market fit. And I'm throwing out terms now. We weren't using these terms back then. We were still doing business plans, y'all. So I know we don't do business plans anymore. I know everyone does a canvas and everyone does an executive summary. But in the old days, we still did business plans. But going back, 20 years, and I think about access to capital, I had 2 partners who were securities lawyers. That was the first time I'd ever seen a cap table, an operating agreement, articles of incorporation, amended articles, authorizing you to raise capital. That was the first time I had seen a prospectus for a Reg A or Reg D offering. And so I literally grew up as a tech entrepreneur and, fascinated with the legality of the process. So our docs were tight because, my partners were securities lawyers. And so in those days, and interestingly enough, I had a conversation with Emmett McHenry yesterday, and he's going to be speaking for us next week at our OHUB homecoming. Emmett was the original founder of Network Solutions. So we all looked up to Emmett. The iconic folks that you would look up to back then were like Emmett McHenry, who was the father of domain names. To get a domain name, you had to go through Network Solutions, and he was the founder of Network Solutions. There was Steve Case with AOL. We used to look forward to getting those CDs, Carmen, because every CD was like faster than the last, right? So Steve was like a marketing, genius. And he and I were having this conversation about a month ago because while he was working to bring America online, I needed Black people to be online so they would go watch the Black churches that we were streaming online.
Absolutely.
And, and I'm going a little deeper, but, and so Emmett was a mentor. There were 3 founders that were on a national platform, meaning we had some media back then. My very first media story I was on the cover of Rolling Out. And this is when Rolling Out was still distributing. Munson Steve was still putting print. He still had print distribution in like, I don't know, dozens of U.S. cities. And so I was on the cover then. That was my very first print article. But it was 3 of us who had raised venture capital, over $1 million. It was Omar Wassel at Black Planet in Chicago. Actually, Steve Case was the investor. Clarence Wooten with Image Cafe up in Baltimore. He raised more than all of us, like 20 million. And myself, we raised a little over 4 million in Atlanta. So I guess history may record that I was the first Black founder in the South to raise over $1 million in venture capital. So that's how I got my start in tech. And you ask about what was hard and what was easy then. Building anything, that's hard is going to be hard. And so it wasn't easy. I had only been married a couple of years and had a daughter. And there were some tough times where I would be out selling, to content providers, to churches, going to investor meetings, and didn't know how we were going to pay our bills. And so those were interesting days. When I look back over it, what was interesting then is there was not a lot of conversation or talk about increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in tech. And all of us were outliers. We didn't have a lot of support from family and community. And a lot of you, even today, you may feel like you're building a tech company or a high growth company. And when you say you're building a startup, folks are like, oh, that's so cute. Oh, wow, you got a hobby. Not understanding that, we're trying to change the world and build moonshots to create multi-generational wealth, And I remember going through those days. They're like, look, you got advanced terminal degrees. Why aren't you working a job and making good money? And then, when you become successful and create wealth, people are like, hey, how did I not get the memo? So I would that's a walk down memory lane to get us started. Today, I think there's so much noise.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone is interested in building a startup because they think it's a golden ticket to success. And so you have a lot of people that are jumping on the fad of entrepreneurship or the fad of the ecosystem and aren't truly interested and or committed to solving something obsessively. And so, I'm very discerning, a little grumpy at times because, I thought the game was to master the game and to become wealthy. And then I learned that there's no fun, if the homies can't have none, So
That's it.
Right. So I started to think about how to create an ecosystem that would normalize the work that you do or I do and the other founders or the investors, the ecosystem builders. So every time a founder, closes a seed round, it's not like an act of Congress.
Yeah. So that's great. And one of the things you said earlier when you were talking about the jargon, because I'm gonna watch how I dovetail this into my next question. What I have experienced is people use startup jargon as a fence, as a barrier, right? It protects it on one side, it leads other folks who don't know to believe that those folks know more than they actually do. And then on the other side of that fence are people who really need to know, but no one's teaching them. It seems like these things are just out of reach. And so as you build, and as I build, and all of us who do this work, I just want to know your thoughts about building inclusivity across marginalizations, right? So, like we don't want to create systems that have to be then recreated because they still contain barriers. So I'm thinking particularly for people who identify as women or non-binary, gender fluid. We're talking about our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. Those of class, because we can have a whole nother conversation about classism. And the barriers in the tech ecosystem, and even also ability. Like I always pay attention to when I go into co-working spaces, if there's accommodation for people in wheelchairs, for people who use crutches. Is there a space for people who have intellectual disabilities within our ecosystem? So how do we build inclusivity across marginalizations? Or what are your thoughts on that topic?
Sure. Sort of contextually, when we started Opportunity Hub, so my wife and I started it together. And I know a lot of people say when they're negotiating, well, let me go check with my wife. Like, I really do. Like, it's our money. You know what I mean? And I live for the benefit of her and my children and my children's children. And so we have worked to structure what we have been able to accomplish, even though a lot of times it may seem like I'm the one out front and she's the one behind the scenes. And I think because, I'm building this to go somewhere, the humanization part of it is I've been approached and pitched about money and partnership and speaking and mentoring and coaching so many times. The fastest way to get me to say no to you is for you to not see my humanity and the humans that are with me. And so many people will approach me and not even acknowledge the family that I have, with me. And so I think being grounded and centralized there is a part of how I like to differentiate the work that we do. That's a part of my North Star. That's a part of my why. That being said, I took a lot of hits, 7 years ago, 6 years ago, 5 years ago, running around this country from the White House to the outhouse, meeting with politicians, meeting with educational leaders, business associations, investors. And normally when I showed up, I'd have an OHUB t-shirt. Every panel, OHUB t-shirt. And what I was doing was making the case for the concept of an inclusive, equitable ecosystem around innovation, entrepreneurship, and investment. And most people thought this space, because they didn't have a preview into it or a lot of experience, couldn't really conceptualize what we did and how we did it. And the first thing that people do is tend to like, oh, you work with kids. Oh, they sort of K through 12 you. And not that there's not great work to be done at the K through 12, but like developing founders and investors and ecosystem builders is really grown-up folk work. It's really the evolution of economic development as a practice. And so what I learned was if the practice was going to be respected, I had to garner the respect of respected organizations. So my brand of respectability politics was to take the OHUB framework and codify it with like the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Reserve Bank, our central bank. And so Dale Gines and I at the Federal Reserve Bank created the guide on building inclusive innovation, entrepreneurship, and investment ecosystems in communities of color. And then I was invited to join the Brookings Institution. There's probably not a politician, a foundation, a mayor, in this country that does not subscribe to it as a think tank. If you are center to left leaning versus the Heritage Foundation, if you are far right leaning, and we're bipartisan at Brookings, but that platform has also allowed our work to be taken seriously. So now, with people around this country, coast to coast, in the middle, talk about, I want to be a startup founder, I want to be a venture capitalist, I want to be an ecosystem builder, I'm launching an incubator, or I'm launching an accelerator, then your credibility is not questioned, and so I'm excited we were able to do some of that, that early work, and now being able to codify it as a national, maybe even one day global framework, but a national framework for wealth creation. And so that being said, a lot of people focus their energy, Carmen, on sort of like the top of the ecosystem building pyramid. They want to focus on being venture capitalists, they want to focus on just being founders, and not understanding that to build an inclusive ecosystem, there's the early exposure, there's the socialization, there's the frequency of that socialization, there's, the education and skills. Do you have the skills to be a software developer? Do you have the skills to be a salesperson, a technical salesperson? Do you understand entrepreneurial governance and cap tables and taxes and all the things that go along with running a business besides just, being chronicled in the media? And if you're not understanding the framework, you're doing a disservice to the ecosystem, because when vultures and opportunists come into the ecosystem, because it's shiny, it's the new thing, it's a new frontier, and I want to be here, understanding that when we see founders, we see families, we see human beings that hurt, that require self-care. And so there's a depth to our approach to building ecosystems, which I think a part of it just comes with living and comes with time. And so I see remnants of our work in different places and different conversations around, around the country, and even like on the continent of Africa as well. I know I'm going deeper, but I also am speaking to the people who are listening now or listening later, because when Black people show up and say, I'm building the ecosystem, and you take it for granted because all you're interested in is, can I get money from them, and can they connect me to somebody? So it's a long way to answer that, but hopefully.
Yeah, I appreciate the humanist approach, because I mean it points to, like, they're like, bring your whole self to work. You want to bring you, and I'm like, do y'all know who you is? Like, you is a lot of stuff. You is me, my mama, my grandparents. Like, you can be a lot, and I don't think people really make that kind of space because they're not thinking of it in that way. So I do appreciate that, and so like to the next question is about, what is the balance? So, I'm a local gov person by original trade, and we don't have tension with entrepreneurs, high tech, high growth entrepreneurship, but there's also that other part of entrepreneurship, or the spectrum of entrepreneurship, where we would have to cater to people who wanted to do a side hustle. If we had a teacher who just wanted a side hustle to supplement her teaching income, all the way to somebody who wanted to open a restaurant. So like, I view entrepreneurship as a spectrum. Everybody's not going to want to do a high tech, high growth tech company, and it doesn't mean, and if they don't, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't get all the resources and help that someone who does gets. And so, what is that balance? Is there like a magic ratio that successful ecosystems have, or how do you strike the balance of supporting those high tech, high growth potential zebras or unicorns, but also saving and creating space for the mom and pops and the side hustles?
That's a great question, and it's interesting. Dale Gines and I were talking about this. Dale, once again, is at the Federal Reserve Bank. We got pushback because the moment you put inclusion in front of anything, well, one, the concept of inclusion has been co-opted by, non-intersectional with, Black and Latinx and indigenous people of color. We do know that the inclusion movement was co-opted by white women that did not include us many times outside of performative alliances. So I won't go there, but the data don't lie there. And so Dale got pushed back because when we talked about building inclusive entrepreneurship ecosystems, they were like, well, what about the mom and pops? And what about the small and medium enterprises? And what about the government contractors? And he was like, well, in the context of ecosystem building, it's generally referring to high density, high growth firms that can scale given the right environment and the right resources, the right teams. And we sort of got offended that people wanted to immediately mom and pop ups, and mom and pop is not bad at all. However, when you look at the global pandemic we're in, we released the guide a little over a year ago, and now over 40% of Black-owned businesses are gone. And, many of them might have provided services that require interaction. And now, because there's not that much interaction or people's buying habits have changed, if your business is not technology enabled, you may not even have a business going forward. And so the times have set the precedent for where the opportunities are. If consumers and people are not able to purchase from you, then maybe you have to sell to businesses, and then you have to sell to businesses that are buying those services. And so I think there's a space for balance where let's look at what is at stake. And I think when you understand the data, so people are like, yeah, startups, that's only, 3% of venture capital goes into startups. Why are we focused on debt? And why are we focused on PPP? And why are we focused on loans and CDFIs and all of the entire stack, which we do need? And I'm like, well, look at the data. 60% of net new jobs in this country. So if 60% of net new jobs are being provided by startups and high growth firms will want startups, and they just, a little bit further down the road because of their traction and growth. So 60% of new net jobs are coming from edge tech, AI, machine learning, quantum, blockchain, virtual reality, augmented reality, Internet of Things, all the buzzwords, right? If that's what's driving new job growth, and only 3% of the investment capital stack is fueling 60% of net new jobs, if we want to catch up as a people, then we've got to have an intentional community focus on developing a high growth ecosystem. Here's the other reason why we should focus on building high growth ecosystems. A lot of high growth companies eventually go public. If one of my board members, David Will IV, he's the former vice chairman of NASDAQ, had a ton of data that demonstrated high growth firms are also responsible for creating smaller businesses, because when they can hire people and those people have good salaries, they're going out to eat more, they choose time, they're consuming more. And so I think the data was like, for every high growth worker, there were 5 service workers, right? And I'm sure that's impacted now because of COVID and because of just, macroeconomic trends or realities. So if we want to actually close the racial wealth gap equitably, and I think everyone is using like the buzzword now, racial equity and parity. And, when I see equity, I'm like, there's got to be, and I talk about this in my book, Kingonomics, there's got to be some reciprocity in order for there to be equity. If not, Black Americans, particularly Blacks in America that are the descendants of slaves in America, we're just not going to be able to catch up, right? We're not going to be able to close the racial wealth gap. And that's why it keeps sliding down, down, and down. And so what I understand is people have jobs, they have interests. And so they're like, well, if there's money to be put out, we need to make sure our banks are whole. And we need to make sure that all the CDFIs are whole. And we need to make sure that all of these existing institutions are whole. And it's like, yes, and. And so I think that I make the case for high growth entrepreneurialism because that's actually where the jobs are. Even if you aren't that entrepreneur, going to work for the unicorn that, got acquired in Birmingham, right? How many local Birmingham jobs did that create? Or because, and I don't know what's going on in Birmingham per se, but if Birmingham's workforce, educational system, public system wasn't preparing socially disadvantaged communities for those high growth jobs, then what happens is people just move in and take up space, which also leads to regentrification and what we're seeing. I live in Atlanta. I'm an Atlanta native. We are number one in the country in income equality. So, I hear y'all. I hear y'all about Wakanda. I hear all of that, okay? And to some degree, there was a period of time, and it's still a period of time that you could come to Atlanta and you could manifest your economic dreams or what have you. But we're still number one in income equality. And today that is primarily because of our increased innovation density, entrepreneurial density, startup density, venture capital. There's a report that shows, it's a Northwestern University report. I think one of the Canadian universities that showed where there's innovation density, there's increased economic segregation, right? So it seems great when our white allies per se and counterparts are like, we're gonna build a startup community and we're gonna put it here and everyone's gonna be, and it's like, nah, you just really just increasing poverty, dude. I know it sounds good because you'll meet with us and you'll give us free space and you might throw in some of that cool, what's the sparkling water that we use in the startup community in the world. But, my point is it just becomes ultra performative because if you don't get into the data, you can't make the argument of why we should focus on building the density of high growth. And here's the thing, even if you want to be mom and pop, even if you want to be service, why can't you run just as efficient using technology tools and resources to also scale just as if you were a software company?
I agree. I think that's a great assessment, and I am interested in the correlation between increased inequality and innovation density, and I think when I think about policies like opportunity zones, where you essentially can have places, hubs, if you will, that house these incubators that are housed predominantly white-owned companies, maybe Southeast Asian-owned companies. And they benefit from their proximity to poor Black people because they get to be in an opportunity zone and get that kind of, that benefit from that law and get capital, but don't, as you said, that reciprocity. There's no There's no communication with the community there. These people that they've benefited from, none of that actually goes out. So that is definitely something that we want to keep an eye on in Birmingham, or that I will be keeping an eye on in Birmingham. And so to get into the topic of the title, funding for Black founders, you have partnered with Rise of the Rest. And so can you talk to us about what that partnership like means? Because I know you're data driven, and it means something, and how can people participate? Well, by the time some people watch this, the deadline will have passed, but I doubt this will be the only opportunity. So
yeah. Absolutely. You know, I've known Steve since I met him at South by Southwest in the WDC house. It was actually Mayor Bowser from DC who introduced me to Steve and his team. And they were talking about this upcoming tour. And I was like, you got to come to Atlanta. I was selling Atlanta, right? And I know they've been to Birmingham and later cohorts, and made the case for them to come to Atlanta. They came, you know, we worked behind the scenes to get Black founders on the stage and a Black judge, you know, and that's some of the thankless work that ecosystem builders do, because, you know, people become brand new after they hold that check.
Oh. Okay.
Okay. And they think like, because they had to put in work, you know, everyone's working hard. You know, you showing up to pitch and know your business, that doesn't make you special. That's just you doing the minimum, right? Yeah. You know, you understanding your business and your that's not exemplary. That's just the minimum. And it always requires people from behind the scenes to pull the strings per se, or to align things to push people forward. And I think that's what ultimately ecosystem builders, that's what they do. So having known Steve and, you know, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and, you know, many others were just, you know, they were killed, you know, and it was, I think, for the first time in history, there was a parallel to like this invisibility of racism that, you know, it can always be denied because you can't see it, right?
Right.
We feel it internally and we feel it economically. And racism involves power, power involves money. So me being biased towards you for whatever reason doesn't automatically make me racist towards you unless I can impact you economically. I mean, chattel slavery was an economic engine. That's why it was racist. Me not liking you just not to like you doesn't make, you know, me racist. But I could also make the argument, you know, from American history and a social construct, that to be American is to be racist towards Black people, even Black people who are anti-Black.
Yeah.
You know, so there's some depth to that conversation that we can have another day. But so people were reaching out to me. A lot of people. I've told a lot of people no. I've listened to a lot of people, and look, a lot of well-meaning allies think they're doing the work when they call you and ask you questions. They think that's the work. That's not the work, y'all.
Work.
Okay? That hurts. I gotta expel energy. You know, like you have to pay for that work. And so I literally stopped having those conversations until people sent emails and say, we want to partner with you. And so things come full circle. You know, this is not just some overnight success. We have been building this relationship literally for 5 years. And what I wanted to do was do something that had never been done before. I've been an advisor to 43 North and seen the $5 million pitch competition. I helped to almost get it almost got passed and got out of committee to create in Georgia the largest pitch competition in the world. Would have been $10 million because we had to outdo Buffalo, right?
Right.
And so we've been working at this concept of this huge pitch competition for a while, but I didn't want it to be a grant. I didn't want it to be, you know, charity per se. And I think there's definitely a place for non-dilutive capital, but I didn't want to send the message that Black founders don't want to be a part of the capital formation engine or game, that they just want to, free money, right? The balance is the key there. So in a series of conversations, we went back and forth, and I was like, nah, can we get more? Can we get more? And Steve K stepped up, Arnold Mason stepped up, David Hall stepped up, and they committed $1 million to create what would be the largest startup investment pitch competition for Black people in the world. We went back and forth a little bit, and I wanted to make sure that this wasn't for people of color, because we can get lost, we can be invisible in there. Okay. Yeah. It wasn't for BIPOC, which is, I told people I'm not BIPOC, I'm Tupac, so we're rooting for everything Black right now. Okay. And there's intersectionality inside of our Blackness. So I'm not isolating us as well. So after the first $1 million was committed, our venture fund, 100 Black Angels and Allies, committed 100,000 to that pot. So we're at 1.1. And then Morgan Stanley joined and said, we don't want to get left out. And they put another $1 million. And so that's how we got to 2 million. It's really 2.1, but who wants to say it's $2.1 million? It's $2 million competition. And the deadline to apply is October the 25th. And I encourage you, and some people may say, well, I'm not ready to raise $1 million yet. If this was just 25, 50, or 100,000, but here's a challenge in not applying. We're not just doing this for a moment. We've invited venture capital firms. We now have over 100 across the country that have agreed to take meetings with our finalists. So if you don't win, 3 people will win the investment. 10 will be finalists. Mm-hmm. There could be hundreds or 1,000 that are on the database. And we'll gladly provide that database to all 100 venture capitalists so they can look through it and say, oh, I like this pre-seed company. Oh, this would be great for my accelerator, right? So it's about density. So if you're watching this or you hear about it, we want you to apply because we want to be intentional about accelerating access to networks that we as a people traditionally don't have. So that's one of the strategies. Everything we do is not for the moment. It's to build a sustainable ecosystem. So now that we have 100 firms at the table, it looks like and 2 million is huge. We look like it's just 2 million, but those firms represent billions of dollars of potential capital, right? The other thing we're signaling out by aligning 100 Black Angels and Allies is we've got to create a new Black investor class in the ecosystem because the wealth is on the cap table, right? We can cheer for you. We can make introductions for you. But if Black people don't get on these cap tables, then you basically you will still see the wealth of those companies, if they're successful, still going out of the community. The founder will benefit, but normally depending on the series of capital that you attract, you'll end up diluting to a point that you'll be successful, hopefully, but the wealth will escape. So most of the fund managers that I talk to that are Black, most don't have any Black LPs, or they have one, right? And so there's an opportunity if you're not a founder, but maybe, you're a Black person that has a good job. Maybe you work at the power company in Birmingham. Maybe you the, bishop. I'm going to text my buddy who went to high school with me, Van Moody, and say, Van's the bros. Van, I need you to become an LP. We got to get our affluent Black people into this new asset class. I don't get impressed when we see rich Black people put their money in Silicon Valley deals only. Now, I'm in some Silicon Valley deals because of my networks, but I'm in more non-Silicon Valley deals as well because I want to be intentional about how we invest. So when I see those press releases, I'm like, okay, all right, cool. Somebody's not advising them about these anti-Black moves they're making.
Okay, I hear that. I agree. We've seen a lot, and there is an opportunity there to definitely work with folks to build that. So I'm glad that you're doing that work. So we're running up on the end of time, and so whether you like it or not, you are our antecedent. You are an elder. So this has been tough, as you mentioned. There's just the pandemic itself has caused so much loss and grief, particularly in Black communities, particularly in Latino communities. We are at higher risk. There's been so much loss there. The social unrest around racism, and just like the general clumsiness that a lot of our what we may have considered allies through this process, and even the anxiety of this election coming up. So there's a lot, particularly for those of us who are vulnerable in this society. There's a lot to process. And somewhere in all of that, you got to keep your dream alive about your business and somehow roll out of bed on most days and get something done. So if you would, please leave us with some words of encouragement grounded in reality, about keeping the faith and pressing forward.
Absolutely. In college, we had a saying that said, the difficult we do immediately, the impossible takes yet a second longer. And I think what I take from that is my mind was renewed to the point that there was nothing that I could not obtain if I put my mind to it. And, I juxtapose that to those who are familiar with the biblical adage, faith without works is dead. It's not faith if you're not working.
Okay? Right.
You're just talking.
Mm-hmm.
You're just naming it, you just claiming it. But if you're not working, and then it's not just being busy, it's a certain type of focus work towards whatever the mission and the goal is. So then, therefore, we have to study to show ourselves approved. Write the vision, executive summary, summary, make it plain, so he or she that sees it will run with it. The investor will run with it, the customer will run with it, what have you. So there's a lot of spiritual takeaways there. Our unfair advantage in this country, and I'm talking to Black people, our unfair advantage is we can show you how to survive in the worst of times.
Yeah.
Okay. While other folks are losing their minds, trying all type of experimental drugs and all kind of stuff. And, we know also how to create something out of nothing. It's like we are inherently created, it's been passed down to us. And when we unlock it, that invisible grit becomes tangible. And so what I'm encouraging myself and people is this is when we have to be our authentic selves and carry and be the conscience of this nation. That's why this election is so important. That's why this particular time in history, when you've got race, climate, a pandemic, politics, all together, right? And I think it's our people who can see through uncharted territory and muddy waters. But if we don't step up and we listen to these dumb voices that center themselves out of selfishness because of their personal selfish greed and agenda, they will convince you that it's not about creating wealth for all, it's just for them. And so you got to, cut that noise out. We build wealth so that everyone can thrive. And it's not about having an outlier. I'm the only one. Like, stop bragging about I'm the only one. I'm in this room. If you're in the, if year after year, you keep showing up and you're the only one, you're the problem, right? It's not your white allies or your folks who don't agree with you. You're the issue. Like, you're the gatekeeper. And so I would say down with gatekeepers, open doors, open source it. We need to move with resolve. We need to move with intentionality. And right now, we should be leading this country forward versus waiting for someone else to step up. And if we do that in the innovation, entrepreneurship, and investment ecosystem, we can restore a lot in a short period of time because of accelerated opportunities for shared prosperity and wealth. So that would be my message to those who are listening at this particular moment in history. It's our time to step up, and this cautiousness that I see sometimes, a lot of that comes because people, I get it rightly, are concerned about what they can see right here and not what is out there. And if you're not, listen, if you're scared, you need to move out the way and let the people who want to run. We're not trying to eliminate you or get, we're not trying to, everyone's got to have a seat at the table, but some people want to carry the table up the mountain. And if that's not you, that's okay. We're here.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I echo a lot of those sentiments, particularly about the get out the way part. Ludacris, the prophet, spoke about that. And so, we need to have more self-awareness for those who are already ingratiated in some of these systems to understand, what they're willing to do, what they can do, and be straight up about it. Yep. And, and move out the way. So I agree. So, Mr. Sampson, thank you so much for all of your wisdom, your insight, your work. We are grateful. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.